Thank you all so much for attending the webinar or the conference right now that we're starting out. Very excited to be kicking this off formally here. We already had the workshops this morning and looking forward to interacting with all of you in the next few days. There we go. So my name is Nico Larco. I'm the director of the Urbanism Next Center here at the University of Oregon. I'm also the SCI co-director and a professor of architecture and urban design here at the University of Oregon. Very excited to be kicking off the conference this year and going through all the topics that we've been set up for you. This year feels more or less like a decade since the last conference we had, which is in 2020. It was almost exactly a year ago, just a little bit more. We kicked off the conference about a month after the pandemic started, and a lot has happened since then. Last year, we presented this slide to talk about what was happening and what we were seeing. And Urbanism Next, as you know, what we've done for a long time is trying to figure out how understand the disruptions that were happening based on these emerging technology, understanding the cascading impacts of those things, and then trying to shape the outcome so we can really get to community goals. And what we've been looking at historically at Urbanism Next has been new mobility, autonomous vehicles, self-driving cars, and e-commerce. And last year, we started to look at this as well, COVID-19. Over the year, we worked a whole lot to really start thinking about what exactly the impacts were of COVID-19. We have the Urbanism Next framework here, where we look at these forces of change and how they impact things like land use, urban design, building design, transportation, and real estate, and the implications that has on things like equity, health, safety, the environment, and the economy. And what we did is we started to look at how these disruptions are being affected across all these sectors now that COVID's involved, right? Really looking at the direct impacts of COVID on all these things, in addition to these other forces of change. So what exactly happened this year? Well, in addition to a lot of the pain and suffering that we are all very familiar with that's happened because of this pandemic, a lot of other things have happened as well. And this is what we're really focused on looking at this next couple of days. So what kinds of things have happened? Well, one of the things that's happened, which has been a tremendous impact around the country, is this shift to work from home. In the US, the labor force working from home is about 23% across the country. It was higher last summer and then dipped down, but has stayed fairly consistent, about a quarter of the entire workforce staying at home. What's interesting, however, is that that's not exactly the same everywhere. New York City, for instance, has 84% of office workers that are working from home. That is, in urban areas, we're seeing much higher rates of people working from home than in rural areas. And this has tremendous implications for all sorts of the topics that we look at, especially around transportation issues. Now, it's important to realize that not everyone has these exact same options. About 50% of the people who are in the workforce do not have the option of working from home. So, and that's across the entire country. So these impacts are not equitable, not even across all people. What other kinds of impacts are we seeing? Well, one of the largest impacts has been to transportation. A lot of this has to do with many of us not going out at all or not going to work at all. So we had a dip if you look at total trips per week as the pandemic started, and that has stayed fairly consistent. We're now at about 86% of pre-pandemic levels. That's what it was last month. So there's still a substantial dip in the amount of travel that we're doing. And this is not only true for vehicle trips, which is what that last slide was, but also looking at transit trips as well. We are at 26% of the pre-pandemic levels. You saw a huge drop. We've seen this all over the country in different transit agencies, seeing similar impacts, enormous drops in the number of people. So transit has collapsed. Work from home is really exploding. And that has shifted the way that our cities are actually working. One of the interesting things about this is that we've seen this other flattening of the curve. We all were very aware of the flattening of the curve in terms of infections. This other flattening of the curve has happened, which is the peaks that we see within cities. This chart here shows the MTA in New York. Orange is our typical curve of where you see across the day, across the hours when we see peak demand. And the blue is what you see in COVID. This is very similar curve to what we're seeing in terms of vehicle trips as well. So in general, we're seeing a whole lot less peaky travel, we'll say. Most of our transportation investment planning decisions are peak focused. So this could have substantial changes to how it is that we end up delivering transportation and what kinds of changes we need to make, what kinds of investments we need to make. It was really interesting that even though this enormous change is happening at the Transportation Research Board conference, TRB, which is the largest US transportation conference, this year there was only one session that I could find that listed work from home as one of the key topics. I think this is actually something we're going to be having to deal with a whole lot more, and for both good and bad implications of it. Some other changes that we've seen over this last year, rideshare has dropped dramatically. Here you can see the consistent rise that was happening over the past few years. March came around and it plummeted, and we are not yet quite recovered, right? So 27 or nowhere near recovered, 27% of pre-pandemic levels for the amount of rideshare that we're doing. And it's not surprising. People are still worried about being in spaces with other people. The social distancing is still something that we're very much interested in. So the idea of being in a car with someone else has really been limited. So we're not seeing anywhere near the amount of ride sharing that we'd seen in the past. Same kind of things were happening with bike share and e-scooters, enormous drops. So, whereas 2 years ago in the first year of e-scooters, we saw 38 million trips. And then in 2019, we saw another 88 million trips. Things plummeted with the pandemic. Here you can see there's a number of programs around or systems around the country that either closed permanently or suspended operations. We're starting to see that come back right now, but we're still very much in the recovery phase for this. And another thing that happened tremendously was an enormous boom of e-commerce. Here you can see 2018, the second quarter, we're about 10% of retail sales. 2020, a few quarters, the second quarter, you saw above 16%. So enormous growth in the amount of e-commerce. This has come down a little bit in the last couple of quarters, but it's still at a very high level. We've kind of jumped ahead to 5 years where we were projecting that we were going to be with e-commerce. My sense is these changes are not going to go away. The people have worked out their models for how to deliver e-commerce better. We've been in this situation for long enough that we've developed a whole lot of habits around this. I think some of us are really anxious to be out and seeing people again and doing things. I think a lot of these patterns are, however, going to continue to persist. Other things that happened in this last year since we last met, the BLM movement swept over the country and over the entire world. And I think it's a very welcome reframing of, as we all have seen, very deep-seated and systemic inequities. And we feel a real palpable shift here in conversations that we've had with our partners, that we have with cities, the conversation you can see around the country. And we're heartened that this actually, we're going to be seeing changes. We are seeing changes. The important thing for us, and is incumbent upon us, is to make sure that we can put these changes into action. And a key part of that is really, we've heard the discussion a whole lot, definitely in planning circles, is relinquishing some of the power that exists right now in cities, and turning that over to communities, the more segments of the community that have not historically had power. And that's, I think, very important in the work that we are all doing. What other things? What are the impacts that we've seen of some of these changes that I talked about earlier? Well, on the one hand, we're seeing a whole lot more of this. This is not a new trend, right? The impact on commercial areas continues to be seen. So what we were seeing with e-commerce and the shutting down of a whole lot of big box stores continues to exist. This last year, we had the largest number of stores closed in the history of the country. This last year was actually one of the last 4 years. So 3 of the last 4 years have had the highest number of store closures that we've seen in the country. This is not a new trend. We're just seeing it accelerating and continuing. This has tremendous impacts for cities in terms of these are blights on the community. These are areas where no longer have the tax revenue, no longer offer jobs to people. So there's a lot of things that we're going to have to deal with these impacts of e-commerce. Again, nothing new here. This is becoming much larger. So what has happened is that tremendous growth in the warehousing sector. As e-commerce has grown, there's been more and more warehousing that's happening throughout the country. Amazon just announced a couple months ago that it's opening 1,000 warehouses in suburban neighborhoods. So not just these enormous distribution centers outside of metropolitan areas, but also these centers right in communities so that they can quickly deliver goods to people in neighborhoods around them. E-commerce as a percentage of warehouse leasing is at 20.8%. That was about half of that in 2019. So huge growth in e-commerce warehouse leasing. And it's at 15% increased cost of warehouse parcels compared to what was happening in the last 10 years. So there's big change here happening. And if we think about the morphology of cities and where these things are happening, where these warehouses exist, to think about this also means an increase in traffic. E-commerce travel is not a savings of travel, right? There's more travel that needs to happen when you do e-commerce. And Goodman's actually going to be talking some more about this on Friday in one of the plenary sessions. Other things we've seen is this wonderful shift of public space actually being used as public space. And we are absolutely thrilled to see that and welcoming that. Enormous amounts of bike networks developed very quickly ad hoc around cities, and many of those things are starting to become permanent. We're also seeing spaces like the street starting to be used for all sorts of other uses besides cars, parking lots being used for other uses. And there's a big push around this country, and I'm sure many of you are hearing that as well, that interest in these changes becoming permanent. So there's a newfound understanding of the speed of the change can happen, and a newfound appreciation for the benefits that we can get from these changes. So that's a real positive shift that we've seen in the last year. One really big question and changes that we've seen is what's going to happen to cities. There's been a lot of ink spilled on the idea that we are at the end of cities, and as in the session that we were in this morning on the workshop we were in, I think that we could have a whole wonderful volume of books that could be written on previous predictions that the city was about to die, and they've all been wrong so far. So I would continue to say that we're wrong in that as well. Cities will persist. I'm definitely not part of the doom and gloom camp of what will happen in cities. Cities will persist, and the truth is, if you look around what's happening in cities right now, the real estate impacts in terms of residential have been fairly muted when you compare them to suburban areas. We've not seen enormous drops in home prices or home sales, urban versus suburban. We have seen some changes in rent, which is really interesting. People are maybe testing being out in the suburbs, or just saying, well, maybe I don't want to pay the high price of being in a city if I don't have the amenities. The real exceptions and where a lot of ink has been spilled is in New York and San Francisco. High price cities have seen this shift of where amount people are willing to pay for properties, but we haven't seen that wholeheartedly across the entire country. It really is the commercial sector, however, is starting to see some questions and some softening in central cities. But again, the demise of working in the office is not the same thing as the demise of cities. As cities really need to recast themselves, I think this is a really good opportunity as places to live, as much as place to work, which has a whole lot of implications in terms of how it is that we might need to shift zoning, how much parking exists in these cities, making sure that buildings that are being built can be repurposed for other uses. This is a time of a lot of uncertainty, how much land we dedicate to retail, all these sorts of things. At the same time, what we have seen, which is really interesting and also continuation of existing trends, is a shift to neighborhood centers. Is work from home continues, the idea of being able to get to walkable, pedestrian-friendly and amenity-rich neighborhood centers is growing even stronger. So that's a shift that we've been seeing for a number of decades, and my sense is will continue to happen throughout this time. So one of the questions or one of the things we say all the time at Urbanism Next is that doing the same thing when everything is changing is a problem. Now, we were seeing a lot of these disruptions before the pandemic, and we would use this phrase in terms of changes that we were seeing with e-commerce, with new mobility, eventually with the advent of autonomous vehicles. If anything, the pandemic has simply shown us that that is accelerating, that it's widely understood right now. Plans that we had 2 years ago, really, we understand, it's widely understood that those don't make sense right now. And so the idea of figuring out how it is that how do we act in a quickly changing environment is really important. There's three things that we've been focusing on at Urbanism Next, and they're themes that you're going to see throughout the conference. The first one is really equity, and equity is a first principle and not an afterthought. So how will emerging technology, new mobility, e-commerce affect different populations differently? We've been doing work with marginalized communities and also communities like older adults, and thinking about how these innovations that are happening in all these different sectors are going to be affecting them. In terms of nimbleness, as I was talking about before, the ability to be able to work quickly in a changing environment, I think, is really important. It's really incumbent upon government. You're going to see a lot of sessions this week or in the next few days that talk about how government has taken on this these opportunities, how they've been able to move quickly, pilot things, test them out, evaluate them, pivot, repeat, try another pilot, keep on moving. This is a lot of the work that we've been doing in Urbanism Next, and a lot of the work that is going to be happening at this conference. And really, the question I think that we want to really cast in the work in the conference this week is, how are we going to be reshaping the opening? How are we going to figure out how we come out of the pandemic and what's going to be happening? There's a tremendous opportunity for us here. In the next few months, my sense is, hopefully, if we continue with the way that we're going with the vaccines, there's going to be a substantial reopening. And we've said a number of times, it's very possible we're going to be seeing the roaring 20s. I think we're all have an enormous pent-up demand to be with other people, seeing other people out, and there's a lot of opportunities around this. Very possibly, we're going to see ride-hailing pick up again. Scooters could potentially have a record summer, and my sense is e-commerce is going to continue its long growth sprint that it's been having. So how are we going to shape this future, and how do we make sure that we are mitigating the negative impacts of the changes that we're seeing, the new technologies that are emerging, and how do we make sure that we are leveraging opportunities to reach community goals? That is really what this conference is about this week, and what we're coming together to figure out. So let me tell you a little bit about the conference, if you haven't had a chance to look through the schedule very much. This morning, so all these times, I should say, are in Pacific. So for those of you on other parts of the country and other parts of the world, I know we have people from Asia and from Europe joining as well. You can do the time calculation, but in the mornings, this morning we started out with the workshops, fantastic sessions that we had there. We're doing the welcome right now, and soon we're going to have David Zipper speaking to us. Very excited to have him. This afternoon, later on at 5 o'clock in Pacific time, we're going to have Liz Ogbu giving a presentation, and you can join that again through the portal. On Thursday in the morning, we're going to have coffee chats, and this is one of the things that we're really trying to do, and that we missed tremendously from seeing you all in person, is the opportunity for all of us to get a chance to actually talk to each other in more informal settings. So what we're doing is, on Thursday and Friday in the morning, we're having these coffee chats. The one tomorrow, I highly recommend that you join. We've got 4 of them: emerging tech and urban design, federal policy, pilot projects, and what's going to stick with COVID, what's worked and what hasn't. This is a really good opportunity for people to just get together, talk informally over a Zoom meeting, and hear what we're each doing. We're going to have the plenaries on Thursday morning, and then 2 breakout sessions, 2 concurrent sessions, 1 and 2 happening later in the day. In the afternoon, we have posters. Really invite you, a fantastic set of posters that we've gotten from people talking about a range of different issues around that relate to the Urbanism Next framework. And then at 2:30, again, an opportunity for all of us to talk to each other and actually communicate one-on-one, is a happy hour. So we've got a range of different things happening, from like scavenger hunt. We have a mobility balderdash. There's a Where is Bernie, which I have a vague idea of what that's about, is going to be happening. So we really invite you to participate in those and get a chance to talk to other people. On Friday morning, again, 8 o'clock Pacific time, we're going to start with the coffee chats. Those are going to be data and digital twins, public and private partnerships, equity, and urban design. Again, great opportunity to get together and talk through issues in a more informal setting. We're going to have the Friday plenaries. And then we've got our concurrent sessions 3 and 4, and then we'll be done 1 o'clock Pacific time on Friday. We have a great set of sessions set up here for this week, and we really are looking forward to having everyone participate in those. For those of you who don't know, this is who Urbanism Next is. Becky Steckler, Amanda Howell, Tiffany Swift, Juliet Koa, Matthew Stoll, Tristan Gouverneur, and Marsha Graveson. Tremendously hardworking, fantastic group, and have really enjoyed the way that we've been able to come together over this year of being in the pandemic and really pushing a lot of our work forward. It's been a fantastic group. We have Urbanism Next faculty, a number of different people across departments here at the University of Oregon that we've worked with historically and continue to work with, and that we're very excited about. The other things I wanted to mention just quickly is one, we continue to have the Nexus. We launched that last year in January, and this is a one-stop shop kind of location for understanding how it is that these emerging technologies are going to be impacting cities. So there you have it that talks about things like the technologies themselves, the potential impacts, organized across the Urbanism Next framework, broad implications, and then what you can do about them. We've been thrilled about the number of people who've used that over this last year, and we invite you all to go there, both to learn for yourself, but also it's a great way to share with people who are trying to introduce these topics to. We're also very proud of this last year. Within the pandemic, since this last conference, we've done a number of different reports at Urbanism Next. With the Knight Foundation, we've done work on equity, around AVs and new mobility as well, a framework for understanding equity itself, and then a whole lot of work on thinking about tools and levers that cities have to be able to shape the outcomes of these technologies. But with AARP and RAND, we've been looking at how new mobility is affecting older adults, and new mobility in AVs will be affecting over adults. I invite you to take a look at that. We have 2 reports that we came out with on COVID-19 impacts. Some of the materials that I talked about today are part of those things. You can find those online. We put out the pilot playbook that looks at a range of pilots and best practices. And then finally, with funding with the Knight Foundation and a number of partners, we put together the future of public spaces and placemaking, which really looked at how new mobility and AVs are impacting public space itself. Really interesting work there. I'll also mention that on our website, you can find the COVID-19 pages, which talk about, in addition to the reports that we've put out, have resources on how it is that COVID-19 has been impacting these different areas. I want to take a moment to thank absolutely our steering committee members. It's been a great group, meeting for months throughout the pandemic, put in many hours to make this all work and to help select the sessions that we have today. So Brett Kelver, Brad Kilby, Alexander Gomez, Mary Stewart, Jean Seneschal Biggs, Will Herbig, Scott Clark, Terrence Sebia, Jess Zimbabwe, Tamar Shapiro, and Aaron Golub from a range of different organizations. Really, really appreciate them. I also want to take a minute to thank especially Becky, Juliet, and Marcia from Urbanism Next, who've helped put this all together, and from UO Conference Services, Elizabeth Moore, Ari Brasfield, Gretchen Heberling, and Linda Smith, who've made this all possible. Thank you. We hope that you continue to tweet and share your ideas in social media. We're using the hashtag this year of Urbanism Next 2020. Look forward to seeing your comments and thoughts on that. And finally, I wanted to give a thank you to our partners and sponsors, especially many of these partners were partners that we've had in the last year through the pandemic that have stuck with us and have been tremendously supportive. For our specific partners, NUMO, the American Planning Association, both the national chapter and the Oregon chapter, ASLA Oregon, AIA, both the National Regional Urban Design Committee and also AIA Oregon, and then ULI Urban Land Institute, both the national and the local Northwest chapter. In terms of sponsors, very thankful to Uber, the Knight Foundation, Waymo, NUMO again, Nelson Nygaard, Translock, AARP, Parametrics, ODOT, ZGF, VIA, PBOT, WSP, GEL, Portland General Electric, Eco Northwest, Fair and Pierce, and the Urban Decision Group.